Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to talk a little bit about anxiety disorders and how that impacts and influences the brain. So, the big thing about anxiety disorders before we get started, today is going to be a lot of let's compare an anxiety disorder to the normal experiences of anxiety that many people experience on a regular basis. And so it's important that we can differentiate these two things as we move throughout the lesson today. So, with that in mind, I want you to think about the experience you have when you get anxious. Imagine that you've got a really big test coming up, or maybe you've got an interview that you're about to go to for your dream job. And we know what that feels like. We know what it feels like to be anxious. You might have an increased heart rate. You might have some sweaty palms. You might have disruptions in your appetite and disruptions in your sleep. You might get headaches. You're restless. These are all symptoms of anxiety, and everyone experiences these symptoms from time to time, usually episodically, meaning because something is happening in their life that is causing them to experience anxiety. But today we're going to be looking at anxiety disorders. We're going to look at when some of these symptoms show up, but they are not necessarily caused by these episodes in our lives. And so I have a list here of some of the different anxiety disorders that we will discuss. And if you want to pause and jot them down now, you can, but essentially recognize that those are going to be the next 5 slides of this lesson. So let's go ahead and start with phobias. Phobias are perhaps one of the most misunderstood disorders of all disorders that we will talk about in this class. There are many people who claim that they have a phobia about something, when in reality, they simply have a fear of that object. So, a specific phobia is not the exact same as a fear. I'm not a big fan of spiders. I don't like them. If I see a spider, I'm going to squash it. But I don't have a phobia of spiders. Recognize that a phobia is an uncontrollable, irrational fear of an object to the point where I change my daily routines. I change my behaviors. It impacts the way that I live my life because I am afraid of potentially being exposed to a spider. A fear is very reactive. If I'm on the couch and I look over and I see a spider on my wall, I'm afraid. A phobia is preventative. Think about that. A fear is reactive. It's because you have witnessed something. I'm afraid of heights, and so when I go on a roller coaster, I'm now afraid. A phobia is I'm going to change my behaviors to try to prevent myself from even being exposed to a particular stimuli. And there are a lot of different types of phobias. There's phobias for spiders and snakes and heights and dark places and cramped places. And rather than list all of these different phobias individually in the DSM 5, the name of these disorders is simply specific phobia. And so a person may have a specific phobia about heights or cramped places or public speaking or death or whatever it may be. It doesn't list them individually, it lists them as specific phobias. Now, there are two kinds of phobias that are so common that they do have their own kind of individual recognition in the DSM 5, and those are the two that we're going to talk about next. So, one type of phobia that is, relatively speaking, quite common is what we call social anxiety disorder, and it used to be known as social phobia. They changed the name from social phobia to social anxiety disorder with the DSM 5. The idea behind social anxiety disorder, again, preventative, is it is an intense fear that people are judging them, that they are watching them, and the result is they will change their behaviors to avoid public places. We're not talking about shyness, right? There are plenty of people who are shy in this world. There are students in my classroom that if I have them speak in front of their classmates, they get shy. Or if they know that they have a group project and they need to stand up in the front of the room and present to their classmates, they get really nervous and they get really shy. That's normal. That's personality. Some people are shy, some people are not. But with social anxiety disorder, these students have such an intense fear of being watched and judged by their classmates, they may not even be able to come to school out of fear that they might be called on, out of fear that in the lunchroom someone might be watching them eat. And so we have students, for example, that go on homebound because of social anxiety disorder, because it is disruptive. Think about the 3Ds with abnormal behavior. Social anxiety disorder disrupts the ability to live a normal life. It is debilitating and it needs treatment. Another type of phobia that is common enough that it kind of deserves its own recognition is what we call agoraphobia. Now, with agoraphobia, it's not necessarily this fear of going out in a public place because people are going to judge them. Instead, agoraphobia is this fear that they may be in a situation in which they can't escape. They can't control the world. They can't control the things that happen around them. So with agoraphobia, the fear is, I don't want to go out there because something might happen. Something horrible might happen where I need to get help and I can't. So as a result, people with agoraphobia often remain in what we call a safe zone. Maybe that safe zone is their neighborhood. Maybe it's their street. Maybe it's their house. Maybe it's a room in their house where they have a difficult time leaving their home out of fear of what is beyond those walls because it's beyond their control. And so, again, it's not necessarily this fear of people. They could have people come to their home. Instead, it's a fear of kind of these open spaces in which they can't control. And that's the idea of agoraphobia. Now, panic disorder, I want to make sure that we understand the difference between a panic disorder and a panic attack. Panic attack is an experience that anyone can have. A panic attack is an extreme spike in our nervous system. It's this extreme spike of arousal of fight or flight, where we have many minutes in which our body is in such a heightened state of arousal, it is debilitating. People experiencing a panic attack often describe it as if they're having a heart attack, and they feel like they are choking. They can't breathe. They may collapse to the floor. They may be in tears. They may feel numb. And it's usually a few minutes of this just real intense fear, followed quickly by almost this wash of exhaustion. And again, anyone can experience a panic attack. A panic disorder is characterized as someone who has multiple panic attacks, but without any particular cause. So if you have someone who does not have any diagnosable disorder, but they realize that they've lost their job and their home is going to be foreclosed on, and they have all of these bills that are piling up, and they feel like they can't take it, they may have a panic attack. A person with a panic disorder may experience a panic attack multiple times a week or even multiple times a day, but not because their house is about to be foreclosed on. They just experience it because it's part of this disorder. And so it's repeated and unexpected panic attacks. That is characteristic of a panic disorder. And then finally, the last anxiety disorder I want to talk to you about is the most common anxiety disorder, and it's what we call generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. About 7 million people in the United States experience GAD every year. And I want you to think about that feeling you have, again, before a big test or before a big date or an interview. That feeling of anxiety that we all have. A person with generalized anxiety feels that way most of the time. But it's what we call free-floating anxiety, meaning it's not tied to any one event. It is this feeling of restlessness, fidgeting, sleep disruption, loss of appetite, again, headaches, heightened autonomic arousal, so heightened heart rate, for example. And these physiological responses are taking place throughout the day, but it's generalized. It is not linked to any one specific event. So looking at how anxiety is impacted by the brain, there's some things to note here. First of all, the onset for many of these anxiety disorders is later than some of the other disorders we'll talk about in class. Like the average onset for generalized anxiety disorder is around 30, 31 years old. Now, we still see plenty of anxiety at younger ages. We see anxiety in high schools. But the median onset, again, is in those 30s. And there's some things that we're learning about anxiety in the brain. For one, when we look at the genetics of anxiety, we see that there is certainly a link there. For example, if we take identical twins that have been separated at birth, so they share the same genetic code, they are more likely than two random people to develop similar anxiety disorders. So there's clearly a link here. We also have found that the brain of people suffering from anxiety disorders produces different levels of neurotransmitters when compared to a healthy brain. For example, a person with anxiety may be more likely to produce glutamate and norepinephrine. And these are excitatory neurotransmitters that put our body into action. And then we also have seen, especially with GAD, that brains with GAD tend to produce less GABA. And again, GABA is that neurotransmitter that slows us down, that calms the body down. Clearly, if we don't have enough GABA, there's a higher chance that we may experience anxiety as well. And then another really interesting part of the brain when looking at anxiety is the relationship between the amygdala and our frontal lobes. So the amygdala, that is our strong emotional center of the brain. The amygdala is activated when we become aggressive, when we become angry, and when we become afraid. The frontal lobes, that's the logic center. That's the part of our brain that helps work us through things that are likely to happen, cause and effect. And it also helps with memory. So if we think about this for a moment, imagine that you're driving down the highway and you look over and you see someone in your rear view mirror and they're making a really angry face at you. Well, if a really angry face is being made in your rearview mirror, your amygdala is going to start lighting up. And it's going to send that message to your frontal lobes, and your frontal lobes are going to analyze that information. They are going to try to think critically and of cause and effect, and they're also going to pull in memories of what this might mean. But what we have found with anxiety is the connections between our amygdala and our frontal lobes don't seem to be as efficient. In other words, we may find that someone with anxiety is getting worked up with their amygdala, and they unfortunately don't have their frontal lobes to work them through to a logical conclusion that, hey, everything's probably going to be fine. So it's not just a psychological, let's snap out of it, but it is a physiological, biological response to the brain struggling to make the connection of, let's think this through. Let's think of the consequence, and let's think of what might end up actually happening in this scenario. So I hope that makes sense. Went through quite a few different disorders there. If you have questions through the material, send me an email. Good luck.